And today I'm going to focus on three major aspects in crowdsourced policymaking. We're going to talk about motivation factors, outcomes and challenges in crowdsourced policymaking. And I've structured the talk into three parts. So first we are going to look into the government's perspective. Basically we're going to learn what crowdsourcing is in policymaking, why we do it and how we do it. And then in the second part we're going to focus on the crowd's perspective. So we're going to jump into the actual end user's perspective and see why the crowd participates, what their expectations are, and also what type of things are they experiencing when they participate in crowdsourced policymaking. And then in the final part, we are going to focus on outcomes and challenges and the way forward in crowdsourced policymaking. And let's first travel to Finland, which is my home country. And I just want to point out that in Finland, we have something in common with Australia and this area in general. In Finland, we have northern lights, whereas here you have the southern lights. So I'm happy to share this experience with everybody. So in Finland, we have snow most of the year round, particularly in the northern part of Finland, just by the Arctic Circle where I grew up. So we move around with snowmobiles in the winter. And let's meet Jaska. He's one of the regular Finnish people living just by the Arctic Circle in a very remote village about 1 hour away from grocery stores or post offices. And he uses snowmobile in his daily life, like to commute, to run his errands, and so on. Jaska also uses snowmobile to herd his reindeer by the Arctic Circle, because in the wintertime, that's the most convenient way to actually get around to remote areas for him. But Jaska is not very happy about where and how he can ride his snowmobile. So basically, he's not happy with the off-road traffic law. Off-road traffic law governs off-road traffic, basically all the traffic that happens beyond established roads, like riding snowmobile or riding ATV in the summer. And we do have a law that has been in place for about 20 years, but there are a lot of complaints that the law has been now outdated and it should be reformed. And the law has two basic goals. It should protect nature from the harm that off-road traffic causes, and also it should ensure safety of the off-road traffic drivers and also other people. And Jaska is not alone with his complaints. There are a bunch of other stakeholder groups that are complaining about the law. For instance, landowners, they are worried about the amount of compensation that they get when their lands are being used for off-road traffic. And then we have indigenous people in Finland who are actually the only officially recognized indigenous people in Europe, the Sami people. And they use snowmobiles for herding their reindeer, for hunting, and also for fishing. And they would like to have special permissions for using off-road traffic. And then, of course, we have basic snowmobile owners' rights, like Jaska's rights. And then, of course, the basic values of nature and preserving nature as it is. And then just every man's right to peaceful environment. Let's say you have a cabin somewhere in the backcountry, and you go there for relax and to be in peace and quiet, and then somebody sets up an off-road traffic route next to your cabin, so you might not be so happy with the noise. So all these issues are related to this kind of simple-sounding, boring law. So then our Ministry of the Environment, Mr. Ville Niinistö, he decided that, okay, so then let's reform this law. But let's reform this law in a new way. Let's involve the citizens to the lawmaking process. Let's use crowdsourcing as a knowledge search method in this law reform process. And how we define crowdsourcing here is that it's an online method for anybody to participate on a task that's open online. So it's basically open for anybody to participate, anybody to submit ideas and comments online. And if you look at crowdsourcing as a phenomena in a wider realm, so crowdsourcing has been used very widely for business purposes. Big companies like Procter & Gamble, Eli & Lilly use crowdsourcing for their R&D purposes, for instance, by using innovation intermediaries like Innocentive. So how that works is that they post their problems online. They set up an award, like for instance here the award is $40,000, and if you are able to solve this problem, you will get that award. And also crowdsourcing has been used pretty widely in other policy-making processes, apart from Finland and some other cases that I will talk about today. For instance, Iceland used crowdsourcing in their constitution reform a couple of years ago. federal agencies in the United States have used crowdsourcing in their strategy reforms, like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, have used crowdsourcing when they have reformed their strategies going forward. And what we have in common when we use crowdsourcing in policymaking is this type of a process that I'm showing in this picture. Basically, the process starts from knowledge search and ideation. Then we move on to evaluation, and sometimes the crowd is part of that part too, sometimes not. And then we move on to policy drafting. Sometimes the crowd is part of that part too, sometimes not. And at the end, we have reformed policy. Let's look at the Finnish case, what we did in the crowdsourced off-road traffic law reform. So there was a crowdsourcing platform. Anybody could participate. People were invited to submit their ideas in certain categories, for instance, safety. The question for the people was that they were asked to address was, how could we improve safety in off-road traffic? Please send in your idea. There were also questions about how could we protect nature in a better way, and so on. And all the ideas would pop up on the platform. Anybody could see them, anybody could comment on them, and people could vote them up or down, thumbs up or down. And the process went as depicted in this picture, that in the first phase we focused on problem mapping. So we basically asked people what type of problems and issues they have with the current law, and also with off-road traffic in general. So we call that like problem identification mode. And then after the first phase was over, we synthesized and analyzed all the input with my research team and the policy experts in the government. And then we designed the second phase, where we ask people then to solve the problems that they have identified in the first phase. That meant that we moved on from this kind of complaining mode to more of like constructive, yes, let's solve these problems together mode. And in the third phase, we had a two-step evaluation process. So we had expert evaluation. It was an international expert panel that evaluated the ideas, and then we had also a crowd evaluation process. And then in the fourth phase, we moved on to law writing. And now let's take a step back and think about how crowdsourcing actually fits into a typical lawmaking process in the Finnish system. So this is how the system typically looks like. So it's a civil servants, I guess here you would call them public servants, who write the bills in the government, in the ministry, and they get the order from the minister and from the cabinet. And they would draft the bill by using the help of interest groups and expert committee that they set up. And they do research for the bill. And when the bill is ready and it's approved by the cabinet, it goes to the parliament, where we have 200 elected representatives who would then discuss the law or the bill and then either accept it, revise it, or then send it back to the cabinet and ministers to discuss, and then they might send it back to the civil servants to be revised. And now when we bring the crowd into the process, what happens is that the crowd adds like one additional data point to this preparation part of the process. So when the civil servants are drafting the bill, they would get more information from the crowd. So we can see that the crowd doesn't touch the decision-making process. So it's still the parliament who decides about what happens with the law. So this leads us to this very important question of what crowdsourcing is not. It's not a decision-making tool or method in direct democracy, because as we can see in this picture, it's the parliament who has the decision-making power, not the crowd. And secondly, crowdsourcing is not a public opinion poll. So crowdsourcing is always inherently based on self-selection, meaning that it's people who are interested, who want to participate, who will participate. So it's not a random sample. It doesn't have any statistical representativeness. And that's also the power of crowdsourcing, in the sense that it's the people who have ideas who will share their ideas online. It's not people who are gathered together to talk about an issue. We are not interested in their opinions per se, but we are also interested only in their knowledge and ideas that they are sharing. But why we are using crowdsourcing then? Well, it's because when we use crowdsourcing, we tap into the collective intelligence of people. And collective intelligence is based on this notion that when we have a large and diverse, cognitively diverse crowd, we are more likely to achieve a solution that is better than a solution that's produced by a small, homogeneous group of experts. And when we use crowdsourcing, we extend the knowledge search from the knowledge search among usual suspects, knowledge neighborhoods, as we call it in management science and engineering, meaning that it's typically the civil servants, certain policy analysts and experts who provide the knowledge to the law. But then when we extend the knowledge search to the citizens' knowledge neighborhoods, we get much more, much diverse information that's based on people's everyday experiences. So that's the potential, that's the power of crowdsourcing. And when we use crowdsourcing in policymaking, it turns into a democratic innovation. And that means that people actually, the citizens become closer to a policymaking process. They are able to be part of something that they haven't been able to be part of before. And why are democratic innovations relevant? Why should we care about those? Well, it's because across the Western world, we are seeing this really huge democratic recession in every single country. There is decline in voting activity. There is a decrease in social cohesion. There is decrease in institutional trust, in especially trust in political institutions, like we saw yesterday in many presentations. And I do believe that when we use democratic innovations and we try to study and apply them in an innovative way, we might somehow be able to fight this democratic recession that I'm really worried about. But I'm not saying that democratic innovations would take us directly to the heaven. There is no stairway to paradise here, unfortunately. But I do feel like we would be really silly if we lost this opportunity to use these new technologies and engagement methods to have people to actually participate in policymaking if we weren't really studying and experimenting with these methods. And one simple way that crowdsourced policymaking already makes a difference, if we don't think about anything else, but just the process in itself, is that we have more transparency in policymaking. And we can divide transparency into two parts, horizontal transparency and vertical transparency. And by horizontal transparency, I mean this transparency between the crowd members, basically the citizens. Because as I showed you earlier, when people post their ideas online, anybody can see them and comment them. So that's the horizontal transparency. And then vertical transparency means the transparency from the government to the crowd. So when the government says, now we are going to reform this bill, please be part of this process, and then when and if the government keeps the crowd, the participants in the loop, and posts updates about this is how the process will continue and so on, the participants actually know, oh, actually this is what will happen, that's the next thing that will happen with this law reform process. And that adds to the vertical transparency. So this is inherently valuable in itself. And excuse me. Let's move on with the Finnish case and let's look at the evaluation stage a little bit closer. So with the expert panel evaluation, what we did was that we set up an international group of experts who got a sample of these ideas to be evaluated online. So we got about 500 ideas, 4,000 comments, and we clustered them together to certain categories. And then we set up these 4 criteria that the experts used. And those were effectiveness, cost efficiency, ease of implementation, and fairness. For instance, the experts would evaluate this idea: RFID stickers should be added to all off-road traffic vehicles to decrease illegal riding. And then the experts would use a scale 1 to 7 when evaluating this idea. Then we built a new tool for crowd evaluation. So we invited the crowd again to participate in the process, and we gave them a random sample of ideas to evaluate. And they would use 3 different methods. One method was giving stars, which we called scoring. So the participants would score the ideas based on their preferences. They would use ranking as another method, which means that they would track the ideas to their order of preferences. So they were shown 3 to 5 ideas at a time. And then finally, they would compare ideas as in binary decision-making mode, like they would choose which idea they prefer better. And as a result, we ran some network analysis, and we saw that there's a huge majority cluster and minority cluster, and we could separate these preferences very clearly. And because we did an entrance survey for all these crowd evaluators, so we would know their demographic backgrounds and also their interests, like what their primary interest in the issue was. So we could see that when we matched that information on top of this network map, we would see that the majority cluster was mostly snowmobile owners who wanted to have less regulation. And then the minority cluster was environmentalist landowners and typically women. And then we handed all these results back to the government for further processing. And if you're interested in any of these parts, going deeper, because I'm going really fast here, I encourage you to visit our website, thefinishedexperiment.com. So all our publications are there, and for instance, about the evaluation process, we have published quite a lot already. And another case that I'm touching today is another law reform process that's ongoing in Finland. It's about limited liability housing company law, which basically governs all the apartment buildings in Finland. So if you own an apartment, or if you're a tenant in an apartment, you are basically related to this law. It's about 3 million people who are related to this law. And this process is very similar, apart from one crucial difference. It's the civil servants in the Ministry of Justice who initiated this process. So they have already contacted we completed the second crowdsourcing stage actually 1 month ago, and they are running the process very successfully. So now let's move on to the second part of my talk, where we're going to look into the crowd's perspective. So we're actually going to visit Jaska again, Jaska and other participants, thousands of participants who took part in these 2 cases. First, let's look at the motivation factors, like why does the crowd participate? Why do they spend voluntarily their time online and submit their ideas and discuss with others about this topic? Well, first of all, the participants get a really strong sense of empowerment when they participate. For instance, one of the participants that we interviewed said, "This is actually the first time in my lifetime when I feel that I'm really participating in making of democracy and influencing the decision making in this society. It feels much more real than just voting for some person." Another participant says, the only way to make a difference from out here in the country is really online. All other activity means you have to drive around in your car all evening to get somewhere. It's really impossible. So we can see that the participants feel like they become closer to the decision-making process, to policy-making process, when they actually participate online. So we can see that this type of a simple process can actually make a difference in these participants' lives and also their perception about what their role in democracy is. And we identified 4 major motivation factors. So all these data results are based on data from surveys and about 50 interviews with these participants. So the main motivation factor for the people to participate was just a desire to improve the law. They had specific issues with the law that drove them to participate, to sign up on the platform and submit their ideas. Also, people wanted to learn from other participants, from their peers, and also they wanted to learn from the experts who were present on the platform and answering their questions and sharing information. And also they wanted to hear what others think about these issues, about off-road traffic or the housing company law. And we can say that these drivers are mainly extrinsic, meaning crowdsourcing is an instrumental method for people to participate in the policymaking process. And it's a method to achieve something specific, whether it's changing the law or learning or getting more information. But then in the bigger picture, participation turns into like an avenue for advocacy. It's another way to get your desire through. And also it's an avenue to be heard and listen to others' viewpoints. But interestingly, as we talked yesterday about expectation management, the participants have a very low expectation for the actual impact. So even though these people have a strong sense of self-efficacy in general, because we measure that, so these are people who speak up, who are confident, self-confident, but in this process, they don't think that their idea will be taken to the law as is, but they are more realistic. They understand that their idea is just raw material for the civil servants to consider and blend it with thousands of other ideas. So this is really fascinating to me because the participants are motivated enough to participate and sometimes spend hours and hours on the platform, yet at the same time they know that actually their participation might not make a difference when we think about the end result, the law. But they still take that chance and they want to participate. Another aspect that we have studied really closely is the deliberation and learning aspects in crowdsourcing. And this is fascinating to us in the sense that when we started these crowdsourcing processes, we designed these for knowledge search only. So these are not designed for deliberation, for argument exchange. Unlike the processes that we heard from yesterday in one of the streams in the afternoon, where we had citizen juries and other deliberation moments where people come together and actually the system is designed for exchanging arguments. But here, the process is designed just to get the ideas and knowledge from the people. But still, deliberation happens. For instance, here, the participants are exchanging comments and opinions, and they're asking questions. And then a civil servant from Ministry of Justice chimes in, and he answers people's questions. So this is how learning happens here. And when we measured these learning aspects, what was interesting to us is that these were kind of predictable, that people learned from others, they learned about the law, they learned about the materials on the website, and they learned from organizers. But this was a little bit unexpected to us, that people actually learned to understand other people's points of views. So this is a little bit like a victory in itself. Like, regardless any other results of these processes, I'm happy if I know that the participants have learned to understand why somebody disagrees with them or somebody comes from a different perspective. So here we are unmasking the crowd in the next couple of slides, meaning that we studied who these participants actually are. Where do they come from? What type of a demographic profile they have? And we could see that it's a mixed bag of participants, pretty evenly distributed across rural and urban areas, geographically distributed across Finland, pretty educated. Most of them are full-time workers. And this is interesting to us, the civic activity. So we can see that some participants are the usual suspects, the ones who write to members of the parliament, the ones who participate in town hall meetings. That's about 1/3 of the participants. But then we have the rest of them, 70%, who don't do that. So we also get the unusual suspects who participate in these processes online. And that's valuable, again, for us, trying to engage people who wouldn't be active otherwise. So this is the final part of my talk, and I'm going to shed light to the outcomes of these two processes, and then talk about a little bit about the challenges that we have detected, and then the way forward. So let's talk about the off-road traffic law process first. This was a beautiful process in terms of quite a bit of participation, a lot of activity, press coverage, and so on. But then the process stalled in the government, in the law writing phase, because the minister who initiated the process, he had to leave his position. And the new minister didn't really care about this process. So right now, all these ideas and evaluation reports are sitting on the minister's desk. And that's, of course, disappointing. The other process, the housing company law process, is going really well. And I think one of the key factors here is that that process is driven by the civil servants, who are bureaucrats, who are hired, who will never leave, basically. Whereas the ministers shuffle, and they are influenced by political changes and realities. So I would say, based on this experience, when we have civil servants who are really invested in these processes, the outcomes of crowdsourced policymaking, there's a stronger likelihood that the outcomes are better. And there's actually investment in analyzing and evaluating and channeling that crowd input to the law, to the policy. But there are other challenges that we have identified along the way. We have identified that there's actually a big conflict between the logic of the crowds and the logic of policymaking. And that's one of the major challenges that we are working on right now in my research group. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different aspects in this conflict between these two logics. The first big conflict is the nature of the input. So in crowdsourced policymaking, the input that comes from the crowd is really atomic. It can be really scattered. Whereas in traditional policymaking, that input is very coherent, it's synthesized, it's holistic. So anybody who makes a proposal from an interest group, it's like a ready-made, really beautiful, it can be synthesized to the law as is. Let's look at an example. Here are some ideas from the crowdsourced off-road traffic law process. These are all very common, these are appropriate and good ideas. However, they are very small, they are very touch tiny details. And they don't care, none of these ideas think about whether these are actually feasible to be implemented to the law and whether they affect other laws that are related to the off-road traffic law. Whereas when we look at the actual law and proposals to the law from interest groups, for instance here, we see that it's already like a synthesized section that can be just copied and pasted to the law if we so wanted to, and also that the proposal thinks about how it fits with other laws, and or if it doesn't fit, there's a note for that. And this creates like a big disruption in the flow of trying to integrate the crowd's input to the law, because somebody needs to synthesize and evaluate all these small ideas and think about how these could be in a more holistic form and could be actually channeled to the law. And this is how it feels like for the civil servants or for our research group, like, oh, we got a lot of diversity, we got a lot of volume, but now we're actually sinking into all this input. So what we are calling for here is that we have to have better synthesis and evaluation methods so that we can use crowdsourcing in policymaking in a meaningful way. With my co-author, Ellen Landemore, who's a professor in political science at Yale University, we came up with these 5 design principles that might help us when we design crowdsourced policymaking, those being accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, modularity, and synthesis. And we emphasize that synthesis part a lot because of those reasons that I just mentioned. Another big challenge in crowdsourced policymaking is preference differences, because you have thousands of people to participate. That means there are so many preference differences, and these differences are very practical. It can be about how long a route permit should be in effect, 6 months or 2 months. And we don't know these preference differences before we actually do the crowdsourcing and we evaluate all this input. Whereas in traditional policymaking, it's always a restricted amount of preference differences because they are based on ideological premises that political parties and interest groups have. So the public servants, the civil servants who draft the bill, they know those in advance. So there's less of that surprising unpredictability moment there. And it's so much faster to then channel that input to the policy. But so there are solutions. I'm a social scientist as a background, but now I work with engineers and I studied engineering sciences, so I always believe everything is a design challenge and we can just make it happen. So now we are experimenting with a new type of crowdsourcing. I call it integrated crowdsourcing for now. I'm working with the city of Palo Alto, which is a city next to Stanford University, and we are crowdsourcing input for their master plan, like a 15-year-long strategy for the city. And the city, we had earlier crowdsourcing stages where we had a lot of ideas from the participants. And now we have just launched this new tool where the city publicizes certain points for the policy, like ready-made synthesized holistic proposals for the policy. And then we ask people to comment on those policy parts. Like we see here in the picture, at the bottom line, we can see one person already commenting one of the policy sections. So this makes this evaluation and synthesizing part less burdensome for the civil servants. But now let's go back to Jaska and wrap up this talk. So why do we need to even care about all these challenges and the conflicts between logics of the crowds and the logic of traditional policymaking? It's because we have people like Jaska who willingly participate in policymaking, who think about these issues and try to come up with better solutions. And they spend their time voluntarily on this. So I feel it's my responsibility and also my government's responsibility in Finland to figure out better ways, for instance, for synthesis and evaluation, that we can channel the crowd's input to the policy. And the only way forward with that is to do more experiments and so that we can learn more, and then so that we can share all these things in conferences like this. Thank you so much.